Now you're dead. Hello, friends, neighbors, and fellow VEDSies. For those of you who don't know me, I am Arcana, the wizard. For those of you who do know me, yes, I'm wearing a blue shirt. I wear blue shirts now, ever since the incident. So who am I and what am I doing here? Well, my exact backstory is kind of long and complicated and intricate, and you probably wouldn't understand it anyway. So suffice it to say, I am one of the personas of Matt, one of the many personas of Matt, and my thing on this channel is wielding magic and reviewing games. Well, one game. I've reviewed one game. That's actually why I'm here. I'd like to pick up the game reviewing series that I started a few years ago and never really went anywhere with, Games of My Childhood, where I look at games that I used to play as a kid and see if they still hold up. These are PC games because I didn't have any kind of video gaming console when I was a kid at all. I played all of my games on the computer, so these are all PC games, but they hold a fair amount of nostalgia for me, so let's look at one. The game we're going to look at today came out in 1993 and it's called Companions of Xanth. Before I get too deeply into this game, I should probably explain what Xanth is for those who might not know. Xanth is both a fantasy book series by Piers Anthony and the land about which the series is about. It is a magical land that bears a remarkable resemblance to Florida, and it started out as a trilogy but is now 30-odd books long, and that's a video for another time. In fact, it is part of the favorite books list, and so there will be a review of that at some point down the line, but for right now, you really only need to know 3 things about Xanth to understand this game. Number 1, Xanth is another realm that is parallel to our own, which the Xanthians call Mundania, and the only real difference between the two of them is that Xanth contains magic. In fact, the very dust is infused with magic, and our world obviously doesn't. This means that just about everything in Xanth, from plants to animals to inanimate objects to even the people, are magical in some fashion. People actually are born with a specific magical ability that's called a magic talent. Thing number 2, most of Xanth is based on puns, whether it be the magic itself or some of the plants or animals, they're based on puns. For example, in Xanth, a cherry bomb is an actual literal plant that grows like a cherry but just happens to explode when you throw it. Nightmares are actually horses that bring you bad dreams. Ice cream is a dessert that contains eyeballs that scream. Stuff like that. And finally, thing number 3, and this one's a little bit more complicated, so bear with me on this one. The story of Xanth exists within itself. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say you're watching an episode of Star Trek, and it's an episode of Star Trek where the characters go back to the 20th century, or present day for the people watching the show at that time. You are not going to have any of the characters come across an episode of Star Trek, even though they went back to a time where the show Star Trek technically existed, because for that universe in Star Trek doesn't exist. There might be something similar to Star Trek, but they won't actually see a literal episode of Star Trek, just like the kids from Harry Potter aren't going to come across the Harry Potter series. Stories do not exist within themselves. Except for Xanth. The stories of Xanth actually exist within the Xanth stories. The way that it goes is that there is someone in Xanth, a character, who writes down all of these key events, and these tomes that she writes get smuggled out into Mundania and they get sold in fantasy bookstores as a adventure fantasy. And we read them and believe that they're just fiction. So that's Xanth in a nutshell. And this particular game is based not just on the series, but specifically on the 16th novel in the series, Demons Don't Dream. It's based on the characters and the premise and a little bit of the plot. In this particular book, Xanth has gone beyond the boundaries of just being a book series and is also now a computer game called, go figure, Companions of Xanth. The book follows 2 teenage people from Mundania, Doug, who is basically just playing the game on a dare and never has heard of Xanth and really isn't into fantasy or computer gaming at all, and Kim, who is a huge Xanth fan, has read all the books, all the supplementary materials, all that sort of thing, and is really excited to play the game. And the game, as it happens, is actually a window into the actual land of Xanth that actually exists. You just have to actually believe in it. And at this point, it's probably becoming clear where a lot of my convoluted plot lines come from, isn't it? And in the game, you are actually playing this game in the book, except you're also playing the part of Doug in the book, who is himself playing the game in the game. It's really meta. So you play the part of Doug. Kim is in the game as well as your adversary or rival or whatever, but you don't see a whole lot of her, you just get occasional glimpses into her progress. And the object of the game is basically just to win, to beat the other person who is also playing the game and find the prize. In the book it's a magical talent that you get to keep, but in the game it's just a generic prize. And so you have to navigate through the land of Xanth. Fortunately you have help because at the beginning of the game you choose a companion. That's where the Companions of Xanth comes in. You choose a companion, one of the well-known characters from the Xanth series who is there to help you along the way. Of course, in the book they actually got to choose. In the game you have to choose the one that they actually had in the book, otherwise it doesn't work, but whatever. Now, because a lot of Xanth is pun-based, a lot of the problems that you have to solve are pun-based as well. So this is basically another game of riddles. Go figure. I liked games of riddles. And a lot of the riddles are pun-based, and so it's a lot of wordplay and figuring out what this thing might actually mean and what the alternate meaning might be and how we can actually get past this to the next thing. The gameplay is a basic point-and-click sort of thing. You can navigate around and manipulate objects, and you have options whether you can take it or put it down or talk to it or whatever. And because the whole thing is based on puns and wordplay, some of it gets a little bit surreal. Like there's one point where you come across a door which is just slightly open and you have to figure out a way to get through it. Apparently you can't get through it even though it's slightly open. And the solution to this problem is to take it because the door is ajar. So the door literally becomes a jar, which you use later in the game. Actually, come to think of it, the puns were a lot more fun in the game than they ever were in the books, but that's probably because in the game they were puzzles to solve. In the books, they were just kind of there as often very bad jokes. The game doesn't follow the plot of the book so closely that you have to be super familiar with it. In fact, it really doesn't follow the plot of the book closely at all. What's more important is your understanding of puns and wordplay and all that good stuff. And like I said, some of the puns are pretty difficult, they require a lot of out-of-the-box thinking, and some of them don't really make a whole lot of sense at all, but most of them are pretty fun to figure out. And fun is probably the best word to use to describe this game. By today's standards, the visuals really don't hold up, the story's not that great, and the puzzles don't always have terribly satisfying solutions. But barring a few frustrations, I do remember this game being an enjoyable one to play. It's much like the Xanth series itself. A little bit of lighthearted, silly fun, not something you want to take too seriously. It doesn't really have much going for it other than that, but in the end, this really wasn't meant to be anything more than a silly game based on a silly book. So on the worth meter, this one gets a worth borrowing. And that does it for that game from my childhood. Now, if you will excuse me, I have to go back to using my own magical talent.